Okay, welcome back to Unit 8, and here we're going to be talking about our next art media, which is photography. And this lecture on photography is a little bit different from some of the more recent art media lectures, like such as our lecture on painting or a lecture on printmaking, where I very much broke it up into different types of printmaking, different types of painting. On this particular lecture, we're going to cover sort of a lot like we did with the ceramics lecture. We're going to cover a lot of the basics of how it works, and then the rest is just going to be a kind of a long survey going through time of looking at different photography artists. The other thing I want to say is that this lecture on photography is kind of heavily biased towards American photographers. I apologize for that, um, but there's only so much you can get in, and I wanted to try to make a relatively coherent kind of passage of time from the beginning of the invention of photography all the way to today, contemporary photographers. So the first thing that I want to cover is we've actually seen artists using cameras long before we saw the use of photography. If you remember when we were talking about Vermeer, I talked about how he used what was called a camera obscura. You may also remember that I mentioned that about Caravaggio, um, and that there probably were other artists who were also pretty heavily using a camera obscura. And what the Italian word camera means is room. So a camera obscura is basically a large, no, a relatively large dark room with one tiny hole on one side that allows light to come in, and it makes a projection on the far wall away from the wall that that hole is on. And in a camera obscura, just the tininess of the hole and the way light is bent by that, as the light's coming in the room and then going into, out of through the hole and then out, it basically bends the light. It's a form of refraction, and the refraction essentially functions as a focusing lens. So in a camera obscura, there's no actual lens; it's just the refraction that causes the sharpness. So photography was basically taking that understanding, that knowledge about how a camera obscura works, and then adding to it the understanding of different kinds of photosensitive chemicals, which scientists and artists were starting to become aware of at the end of the 18th century and into the beginning of the 19th century. And it was just a matter of time before people started to really be able to combine these two systems in a way that would actually make an actual successful image. So the way a camera, like a camera that you would hold, works is it shrinks down the size of that room to a tiny little box, right? So the camera is no longer a room, it's now a little box that you hold in your hand. And it controls the quality of the image by controlling what's called exposure. That is the amount of light that comes into that little tiny room. And it controls that exposure two ways. One is through um, the aperture, the size of that hole. Remember how I said that that tiny hole in the room, because of its small size, especially relative to the room, it creates a refracting effect. So small holes in general are better, but at the same side, the larger the hole makes, the more light you can let in. So you can control your exposure by aperture, how big the hole is or how small the hole is, and by shutter speed, meaning how long is that hole open to the light. Um, and this would have been done originally where you basically just attach to your box a small little kind of lens that basically sets the size of the hole. And then you have a piece of cardboard or a piece of board that basically just shuts off that hole. And then you lift it up and you let light in and you count the time 1, 2, 3, and then you shut it down. And that's how you control your shutter speed. But then eventually, people started to make mechanical cameras where that it could do that for you, where you press the button and it goes, and it opens and closes that window for a set length of time. And that's basically it. That's photography. And so for the beginning of photography, the what was made was images on a plate, because the plate, the photosensitive plate, was a one of a kind item, right? So when you made a photographic plate, you couldn't make copies of it. And then someone figure out how to make photographic film. And with film, because it's transparent, you could then project film. If you had film and you also had photosensitive paper, you could make a photo image on film, then project it onto another piece of paper, and you could make an inverse of that on that piece of paper. So then all you had to do is figure out how to make the photographic film to make a negative of a negative image. Then you project light through it, and it makes a positive print on photographic paper. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit as we get through the lecture about depth of field. For right now, just understand that controlling exposure and focus, specifically being able to control aperture, will change your depth of field, but we'll talk about why that's important in a little bit. And for now, we're just going to kind of talk about the start of photography. And so at the very beginning, it was this rivalry between two types. It's kind of like Betamax and VHS, right? Where it was between the daguerreotypes and the talbotype. And the daguerreotype for a while won out, but then of course all of this was replaced by photography using photographic film. And so some early American photographers who kind of experimented with the media very early on would be Edward Steichen and Alfred Stieglitz. And I want to talk a little bit about Lewis Hine. And this will be a good point to talk about two issues. One is depth of field. Let's take a look at this photograph right here. So what depth of field is, or actually any of these photographs really, what depth of field is the ability for the camera to control focus, right? You could take a photograph, and if you have a wide depth of field, it means that everything from the things that are near to the things that are very far away are all going to be in sharp focus. And if you have a narrow depth of field, it means that something is going to be sharply in focus, like let's say him right here. But then as we get further back, everything behind that point is going to quickly go out of focus. So remember when I said about how aperture, right, if a tiny hole itself can create its own kind of refracting kind of process. So because of that, when you have small apertures, you have very deep depths of field, meaning that you can have many things sharp in focus. Whereas if you have an open aperture, an aperture that's quite large, you're going to have a narrow depth of field. Now, you would think in general that artists want their depth of field to be wide all the time. But if you look at these photographs, you can see that one of the interesting things is that when you have a narrow depth of field, it creates a natural kind of focusing because it focuses on the things that are in that range, and then everything that goes beyond that range very quickly goes out of focus. So it directs our attention to one specific thing. The other thing I want to talk about, since we have Lewis Hine right here, and this is probably the last thing I want to say, is the idea that the rest of this lecture is going to be broken up in terms of this theme of like, what is the purpose of photography? Photography being a new media, right, just invented in the last 200 years, photography is still debating as to what its purpose is, right? And numerous artists that we're going to be looking at had different kind of ideas of what was the primary aesthetic purpose of photography. What did photography as an art form do that was different from other art forms? And what was the difference between art photography compared to just commercial photography or just everyday photography? Okay, so that's where we're going to end for part one. That's my 1 minute mark. I'll meet you in